in thinking about plot, simplicity is the guideline or the rule. As I noted earlier in class, that that some writers will push it to the point saying there's only two real plots, right? A man or woman went on a journey, or a stranger came to town. And so I'd kind of like to look at a section from Lovecraft's The Shadow Out of Time and think about how you can simplify ideas of plot here as the character descends into both physical and psychological depths. Peaslee, our narrator, is told through a set of layers of storytelling here. Kind of just open with a sense of, like, you think about all the stories that are going on, as he tells himself in Lovecraft's story. First, you can think about this as a horror story, right? That there's a certain level of suspension of reality, that unreality is kind of coming into this. As Peaslee tries to place himself within time and space, there are some distinct levels of conflict that are going on between the human and non-human worlds here as well. As he tries to think about the pressure that this ancient race is exerting on humanity and its sense of place in the world at present. In terms of the storytelling, you can also think of the three levels in which Peaslee is telling his own story as he goes into Western Australia and descends into the earth. First, the Peaslee's story is one of physical descent into a geological space, a cavern, and so he's narrating his movement into that subterranean space. So in a very physical way, he's descending. But there are two other levels of descent that he undergoes as he tells his story, right? That this is also a mental or psychological sense of descent into recalled space and or into himself, right? That he's trying to recall some other version of himself that he is, both dreamed and experienced. And so he's narrating points of recollection within memory and is exploring not only the physical space of descent, but also the subconscious as a psychological space of descent as well. And then thirdly here, that this is also a mythical or symbolic descent into an other world or into an underworld here. And so much as the Greeks would descend into an underworld after death, Peaslee here is descending into this other world, or into a very distinct underworld of where that world is defined by a conflict between the human and the non-human, and in a very kind of ancient and mythical means. So let's look at the story and try to kind of think about it. I want to suggest that you could think about this as three distinct moments in the plotting. First, his approach of this space where he's going to descend. And as he approaches it, he says on page 377, "I felt that faint, insidious stream of cool air trickling upward from a depressed place, the brooding desert, something real and tangible, though, a hidden gulf of great size beneath the disordered blocks on the surface." And so as he approaches the space that he's going to descend into, this is kind of cool play between what's physical and what's not, what's real and what's not. He's entering a space that is defined by its absence of space. He's going into the ground. He's going into a space that is physically there, but is going into a space where it's marked by its absence of stuff. And so he's entering this underworld. As he does, there are various tensions and conflicts that are present within the story as he tells entering or approaching this space of descent, right? There's the human versus the non-human worlds, right? As he thinks on 378, what primal, inconceivable source of age-old myth cycles and haunting nightmares might I be on the brink of uncovering? He's on the edge of going down, right? At this point, he's on the edge of descent, And so there's a moment of trepidation, right, of uncertainty as he prepares, right? Is he ready to go into that world? And so he feels that on a very kind of distinct human emotional level through a set of anxieties. On 380, he narrates, "I was torn betwixt a longing to flee and a feverish mixture of burning curiosity and driving fatality." Again, like with other Lovecraft stories, right? The character's on the edge of discovery, and that sense of edge there is both marked by an excitement about what the character's about to discover, and a sense of anxiety or uncertainty of whether the character really wants to discover that in the end. And also, as he approaches this, there's also kind of an internal journey that's going on here into his own dreams. He's recalling his dreams as he goes and approaches the space. As he approaches, he feels the millennial, ancient, and eon-covered hidden corridor in which I stood was the original of something I knew in sleep as intimately as I knew my own house in Crane Street, Arkham. And so he's on the edge of going down into that dream world as well. And so how does he prepare for the approach of that space? So he begins with approach and then moves into descent as he moves down into the cave, into the opening in the earth. Yet that night I embarked without hesitancy upon such a descent. Again there was manifest that lure and driving fatality which had all along seemed to direct my course. He goes because he must go down into the ground, that he must know the truth of himself. He must, risk going into that dream world to kind of face the horrors that are there. So it's, the horror that waits for him is both in a physical space within the cave, but it's also in a mental or psychological space as well. What version of himself is he going to meet as he descends into the ground? Here we should think about the link between plot and character, right? That Aristotle in his Poetics would think about what is it that makes for a good story? Is it the plot or is it the character? He would push for the sense of plot, but writers are always wrestling with that question of what is it that forms a good story? Is it a great character or is it a great sequence of events and a plot? And they work in tandem, right? That you need one to have the other. And so particularly when you're trying to narrate suspense and horror, right? That the character, a strong character, has to feel the effects of the building suspense, as it moves towards this kind of horrifying vision, perhaps, as opposed to if you just have a sense of a set of moments of surprise that the character doesn't really feel the building sense of suspense, then the story fails in some way in its plot. And so in what ways does Peaslee as a character and his descent, in what ways does that kind of straight line narrative and building of suspense define the plot here? So as a linear narrative, right, this is a sustained exploration of what the character wants. He must go into the ground. He must descend to find out, whether the stories that he knows are true, and in what ways does that bring him face to face with some version of himself that he may not be entirely comfortable with, right? And that want drives him. It was sheer madness that impelled and guided me, he says. I wanted to unlock something. So he wants that more than anything. He must have that to define himself. This is also a moment of conflict with the non-human world, though. He feels that very acutely as he descends, where he is vaguely disturbed by the human form that I possessed, he says, right? That he knows he's going into this other world as a human being. This primal vault now lay open, black and yawning, right? That he can go into this world, but he also knows that the non-human can emerge from this world as well. And so that leaves him discomforted here. And then in what ways, does he see this as a known or unknown world as he ventures into it? How does he recognize it? In what ways does he in what ways does that recognition kind of horrify him, perhaps, as he moves toward a point which seemed to know morbidly and horribly well, would the lock be undamaged and workable? That is, the thing that's holding the non-human world at bay, right? If he opens it, will he be able to open it, and what will the consequences of that be? And again, that the link here between plot and character is strong, right? And how does what he wants, impact a larger sense of the story of a human presence within the world, and that drives his descent. So we've looked at approach and descent, and then finally the question of when he comes back up out of the ground, is he able to return? As he narrates later in the story in 391 and following, I have no recollection of emerging from this chaos. Utter madness came. The essence of pure nightmare was upon me. The animal impulse of flight, dream madness, and memory merged wildly together in a series of fantastic fragmentary delusions. So when he comes back up out of the ground and reemerges, in what ways does the story stay with him or within him? Does he find a point of resolution to the story? Is there an end to it? We think about, that you want to move towards a moment of resolution in this, within the storytelling, within plotting. What defines that end, though? His experience of infinity as a kind of horror is pointed here, I think, right? Would he ever find a moment of resolution, or does time just extend, in both directions endlessly? At the other end, he tells, was the ominous trapdoor with the cool, damp wind yawning unguarded down to abysses past imagination. And so, when you think about horror, does horror really have an end to it, or does it just open up into other horrors as you imagine them? There's an unwinding of chaos, or an undoing of creation here as well, right? As he makes this descent, and as he returns, as he realizes, as he comes back up out of the underworld, this was what I must carry back to the outer world, if it truly existed, if the whole abyss truly existed, if I and the world itself truly existed. So the journey and the descent into this other world, right, far from like confirming a sense of what was there, kind of takes apart whatever assurance that he had was there from the beginning. The act of descent kind of causes him to question the reality of the world. And then what is, a lot of writers will talk about the idea of epiphany. We've talked about that, the sudden realization of what life is about. What is the epiphany of a horror story, which he feels as he comes back up and returns? What in truth had happened to me? He asks. If that abyss, this is real, then the great race was real. No myths or nightmares, but a terrible soul-shattering actuality. So he comes face to face with his nightmare, and he comes face to face with a nightmare version of his story. That if he realizes, that this is all true, what he has dreamed is true, how does that undo a sense of time, an experience of time, and in what ways does he feel himself dissolving, or his rationality dissolving, as he makes this journey, as he approaches, as he descends, and as he returns? What new Peasley emerges at the end of Lovecraft's story?